owners and the custodians of the land that I live and work on, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and note that sovereignty was never ceded. I would also like to welcome here to this room that isn't a room, a bunch of people who are never in the same place, I don't think, which is the editors of several of Australia's major literary journals. These are people, I think, whose work in the field, in the Australian literary field, is vitally important. And we see represented here a range of very different kinds of journals. So we see journals that are oriented towards a range of readers, journals that publish creative works from new and established writers who publish book reviews, long-form literary criticism, refereed scholarship, and much to test the boundaries between these forms. We all have different publication and funding models in between, ranging from subscription to open access, but we do have some really important things in common, and that is, I think, that our journals are key spaces in which readers encounter works by and about Australian writers. And these journals, I think, are central pieces of creative and scholarly infrastructure that play a strong and often unacknowledged role in shaping our literary culture and supporting our writers. And this takes place both in what they commission, accept and publish, in their hands-on editing of writers' work. And when I talk about writers here, I mean poets and writers of fiction and non-fiction and criticism and scholarship. All of these writers are shaped, supported, influenced by their publication in these journals. But as you'll all agree, this is not an easy time to be editing a literary journal. And that's why we're here today, to talk about the role of literary journals in our creative and scholarly fields, about the threats that we're facing and how we might be able to work together to address them. And we also need, very importantly, to talk about our role in shoring up or breaking down inequality in the sector. So what we're going to do today is that each of the editors will give a 5-minute provocation, and then we will open the floor to questions. So you can pop questions in the chat box as we go, where you can, after everyone's spoken, you can wave your hand at me physically or raise your hand using the option on Zoom. So I thought we might go alphabetically by editor surname, if that's all right, which means that we'll start with Evelyn, and Jonathan Dunk, the editors of Overland, the very recent editors of Overland. Evelyn and Jonathan, are you there? Are you happy to unmute us? Yeah. Great, thank you. Welcome, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, it's wonderful to be talking to you here from Woiwurrung country. And as Julieanne mentioned, we are the editors of Overland. And recent, this is our very first issue. Please do subscribe, although I think most of you already do. So, a provocation, be a few things here to that effect. Joseph North recently argued in his concise political history that the mid-century victory of the historicist paradigm over the critical one was, despite appearances and narratives to the contrary, a victory of neoliberal conservatism. Most of the details of his argument, we can actually just replace the word historicist with the word scholarly and the word scholarship, full stop. So in Marx's dictum, he sees that as a step back towards merely interpreting the world and away from actively changing it. Like most kinds of polemic, North is a fairly limited and rather reductive argument, but it does pose some really interesting questions about the relationship between scholarship, the relationship between criticism, and the implicit politics thereof. I'm not even going to try to address all or even most of them right now. I'm just going to say that one of the interesting distinctions between scholarship and criticism that I see as both a scholar and a critic and an editor is that of access. Scholarship and reading and the debate, the scholarly debate that occurs in universities and in, say, more conventional academic journals like ALS, Julieanne, occurs within, I'd say, probably a more hierarchic or perhaps more stably and more obviously hierarchical space of conversation than a literary journal per se. And that has very interesting consequences for access. Access, of course, of readership, but also more importantly, access to speech, access to the podium. There are other people here, and I think specifically Michelle, perhaps we're going to speak more about this later, but we just witnessed, I think, a very interesting articulation of that fluidity and flexibility with a rather lamentable publication of a piece by Stuart Cook, a otherwise very well-respected scholar, poet and critic. And the pushback there was, I think, very much entirely, as it were, grassroots. And it was a conversation about value and about different kinds of value, with the result that the piece has since been taken down, and a rather interesting, not to say perhaps acrobatic, apology, taking the limits of that. And I don't think you would see that happen, certainly not with the same sort of alacrity or dynamism in a more conventionally scholarly journal, but that's a conversation we can have. In terms of the main problems facing literary criticism and the journals of literary criticism, Evelyn, do you want to talk a little about them?
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much time to sort of frame some of the main issues and concerns. So I'll speak perhaps most saliently to what we've been working through in our, brief tenure in this position. The shifting values assigned to places of publication, other networks of distribution for creative and critical work. We've recently had to leave Victoria University due to the end of their funding relationship for Overland, and we're in the midst of negotiating Overland's future and our future interdisciplinary and institutional support with a different university. But of course, COVID-19 has impacted that severely. The fact that we are in a position where we can continue to adapt and continue to publish and work with writers, with a multitude of writers, bringing in, more individuals in an editorial capacity, also in a creative and critical capacity than we otherwise would have been, is because Overland is an institution that is not reliant on single source funding. What that means is that so much of the work that we as editors do that should be creative work, that should be work, in relationships with our writers and readers, so much of it is just endlessly justifying Overland's mission and our purpose, and negotiating continuing funding through different organisations, which is, of course, deeply challenging and not necessarily what we thought our tenure would look like. So this places, for scholarly journals, this places a burden on them as well. But when we unfortunately narrow the field into, which scholars, which writers, which editors are able to support themselves financially in order to do the volunteer work to keep these industries alive, we significantly narrow the capacity, the diversity, and I think the richness of our publishing culture, just down into, as I said, those who have the capacity to step away from other obligations to volunteer for this kind of work. So we're very proud that we were able to adapt as much as we have been this year, and this recent announcement regarding cuts to humanities funding is, of course, another devastating blow on top of that.
For everybody, I'm sure.
For everybody, yes. Yeah. But I think the financial reality of this kind of work is something that, given that it has been the definition of about 90% of our experience of working in this position that we did not expect, we do feel that it should be perhaps more of a conversation than it currently is, as boring of a conversation as that might be. We feel like we have to talk about that, and who has responsibility in that area, and how can that responsibility perhaps be shared a bit more equitably amongst the community.
Cool. Julieanne, I think you're still muted, I'm afraid.
Oh, you think I haven't done this before. I don't think it's a boring conversation at all, Evelyn. I think it's a really important conversation, and it comes to the heart of the equity of the field as well. And what we're doing in the field is that question of how it's paid for, and who is paid and how. So I think they're really important questions. So thank you both for that. Our second speaker today, moving down the alphabet, is Michelle Cahill from Mascara. Michelle, I will lead the screen to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Just to give you an overview, Mascara Literary Review is a BIPOC, female-led literary publication. We've been publishing for over a decade. I co-founded the journal in 2007 with Bo Kim Ching. There are kinds of challenges that we face in curating, evolving, self-determined dialogic representation of Australian literature. So I'll preface by admitting that editing as a journal is a labour-intensive, and particularly during the pandemic, when writers that we collaborate with have greater needs for self-care due to loss of regular supportive employment, fatigue, home-based needs, etc., which are more complex, and if they have children or if they are disabled, all of these are very real considerations which actually slows down our processes essentially. On this note, I'd like to also mention that today's a special day for me because it's my daughter's birthday. And I wanted to say that because it goes without saying that editing and managing a journal of this nature that is outside of institutional support places enormous pressures on one's family life. For POC writers and editors, I also want to say, I just want to say that editing and managing a journal, that often we are writers, so we have a dual identity, but that is necessary because we need to construct the literary structure, we need to rebuild, we need to build, we need to reform structural discrimination, and we need to also restore the continual erasures of our work. If our work is to survive. So in this sense, the labour that is required of our bodies is exhaustive and penalising, and I don't think that the current funding structures acknowledge and appreciate the full extent of how that manifests and the impacts of that. In terms of agency, I think agency, I've mentioned we're not aligned with an institution. We have been at some times. At some time in the past, we were aligned partially with the University of Newcastle. But for the most of the time, we have not been aligned with the institution. But that's also been an advantage because we have the benefit of being able to speak in a more free manner and being able to collaborate with early career researchers in any case. However, we do have very limited resources, and in some respects as well, I want to mention that unlike some culturally and linguistically diverse organisations, I don't think that we benefit from a particularly popular social media type basis because we have always included the work of Aboriginal writers, culturally and linguistically diverse writers and white critics. And we want to maintain that. That's something that makes us different from some of the other journals, such as Liminal, Jed Press, Sweatshop. We see that as like, it's for us, it's a less reactive space, but it's certainly a long-term process with long-term goals that we're working for a much more, for an inclusive sort of vision of what Australian literature and what Australian literary scholarship can look like in the future. The correspondences take time. I just want to touch briefly on partnerships. We've been fortunate to partner with organisations that are proactively working on undoing structural racism, and I want to mention Sweatshop. It's a very important organisation. It has supported us enormously, and I also want to mention the Deborah Cass Prize. I was very happy that we've partnered with that, partly because when we first started the journal, we were arguing with the Australian Centre at the University of Melbourne, i.e. institutional space, elite, very well entrenched institutional space. We were having discussions with them about the possibility of a migrant writing prize or a migrant writing fellowship that never eventuated. But as a result of those conversations, which did seem at the time to be polemic and just missing their mark, people like Alice Pung were privy to those conversations and that dialogue, and it ended up happening that we were able to partner with the Deborah Cass Prize. So I think that for me feels like something that was a positive outcome of a lot of work that did seem to be going nowhere when we were trying to partner with institutions. Just going back to partnership, I just also want to say that we have noticed that this is a disturbing tendency in Australian literature, that when we have attempted to partner with more elite established organisations which receive an enormous amount of funding from funding organisations in Australia which receive funding from the government, that there has been there seems to have been problems in that not happening, where in fact there was no reason why it shouldn't have. We were sort of being given the go ahead from certain funding organisations that this would be a really fantastic partnership, but in fact it didn't eventuate. And I can think of 3 organisations, very elite organisations, who've received an enormous amount of funding. So I think that there are definitely lines of coalition that are not allowing some kinds of writers to pass in and out of certain spaces within the literary ecosystem, and that's something that we're just persisting with. One of the things in terms of agency is also comes down to what do you do? If you keep doing your work, ultimately you have agency, and we have done our work. We have published an enormous amount of literary reviews, and in fact, considering that we have received so little funding over the years, it's actually quite significant, and that is our agency. The fact that we can continue to do that we have an enormous amount of symbolic agency because of the kinds of relationships that we've been able to establish with researchers and critics and writers, and just in building those relationships with respect, we hope, and you know, just persisting with those relationships. So and we've also recently partnered with the Sydney Environment Institute to deliver an exciting program on sustainable futures in the post-COVID-19 period. So I'm very excited about that. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Wollongong Writers Festival, which I very much like because they're a small organisation, but it was almost like a small peripheral marginalised organisations. We were able to sort of collaborate and do something, you know, positive in small ways, but which was still significant. We judge the Wollongong Writers Festival Short Story Prize, and we co-judge with the Deborah Cass Prize. And one of the things that we do is we pay our judges, and in that respect, we usually try to bring in culturally and linguistically diverse judges, and we pay them, and that gives them agency, and we support them in social media. I just want to touch briefly though on the dynamics of race and gender. This is the hugest challenge for us. Racism cannot be underestimated. It is the fact that, you know, the White Australia policy has, although legally on a legal respect it ended, it has still very much informed what Australian multiculturalism is and how we are seen and perceived, and conversations that ensue are very much informed in casual and small ways by those kinds of dynamics. And that's something that is very wearing, and it's just something we have to wear at this point in time, but we're working on. I just want to mention as well, one of the things that we've been doing is building on what we call discursive empowerment, and I want to talk about that. It's about how do we reform structural discrimination. So one of the things we've just focused very much on trying to get culturally linguistically diverse writers to have their books reviewed in ways that are not reductive, which often happens in the mainstream, or also are not tokenised. It's actually quite challenging to have white writers reviewing culturally and linguistically diverse writers. But we just persisted with that goal. I want to talk about criticism's pervasive one-way gaze, which oversimplifies the invisible worlds of minoritised writers. The exhaustive restructuring labour that renders their materiality is overlooked. Writing from canonical privilege, settler scholarship assumes its own centrality and the assuredness of a knowledge base from which it argues. It takes a particular effort on the critic's part to sensitively frame and interpolate cultural context, specifically and appropriately, into theoretical and historical accounts that may be developed by an essay. We work very hard with our writers to offer a lot of feedback to develop the reviews that we publish so that they are in that way sensitively framed and interpolating cultural context for the benefit of the writers. Too many reviews that we read in mainstream platforms speak for the assumed intentions of culturally and linguistically diverse writers. They tend to theorise their lives and their art without acknowledging this as a speculative and potentially harmful form of objectifying and further disempowering them. So this kind of critical writing risks using culturally and linguistically diverse writers to theorise on behalf of institutional and industry-based readings. So this is sort of basically one of our goals has been to we understand that the discursive privilege and the canonical privilege that settler writers have belonged to, and we're sort of working on changing that, or contributing to that in very inclusive ways.
Thank you so much, Michelle. They're really important perspectives, and I think there's so much to talk about here. I'm hoping that we might sneak over time a little at the end so that we can talk about this all a little more, but we will have to move on to our next speaker, which is Tanya Dalziell, who's actually my co-editor at Australian Literary Studies. So Tanya, over to you.
Thanks, Julieanne. And I guess what I am going to be talking about picks up on something that the two previous speakers as well, so hopefully we'll continue that conversation. But I first just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on Wurundjeri land, and I acknowledge custodians past and present. And I feel like it's a hard act to follow from Lachlan's earlier provocation. I feel like I'm too easily provoked at the moment, so I would more like to have a gentle conversation that we can continue as we move through the session. I'm speaking in part as someone who's relatively new to ALS. I started editing with Julieanne about July or August last year, but I've also had experience editing JASAL as well with Paul Giannoni. And that was about 2008 to about 2010. And I've seen a lot of changes over that time in terms of the ways in which journals have been addressed institutionally. So I guess I'm speaking from a different position from Michelle, which is kind of thinking about how journals and institutions relate. So that's one issue I'd like to touch on, but I'd also like to pick up on her eloquent concerns with institutional privilege. So they're the two main issues that I'd like to think about. So in terms of ALS and thinking about the kinds of challenges that this journal faces in the current environment, Julieanne and I have talked about these in some detail over the past year. And as a journal, which is one of those more traditional scholarly journals, as Jonathan identified some of those in our kind of in our conversation, we are having to think about how, as an independent journal, because ALS is not attached to a university, how that works in a world where online citations and journal rankings and the ways in which journals are roped in with major publishers. Like, how does as an independent journal operate in that ecosystem? And we're finding it increasingly difficult, I think, to getting back to a conversation about value that we had yesterday, about how that value that we think that the journal produces, and indeed its contributors produce, how that is being verified in that academic world. So that's certainly something that we are facing as editors, and just trying to negotiate that really murky world of journal rankings that multinationals seem to very much be at the forefront of. In saying that though, I think there's also real advantages to being an independent publisher, which is what Evelyn and Jonathan and Michelle are also speaking about. And that is that we have some control over how and what and when we publish. And as such, the small amount of funding that we do have, which comes from our subscription base, we can use that to develop the skills and scholars as we want to. So there is also the advantage that we have at ALS of open access publishing. So that kind of again speaks to an issue that Jonathan was talking about regard to access. And when Julieanne took over from Lee Dale and pulled the journal online really successfully, I think one of her ambitions, which has been met, is for scholarship to be accessible. And that's something that ALS certainly wants to continue. But again, it runs into difficulties within this wider ecosystem of, major journals with perhaps funding coming from different sources as well. Again, we'll talk about that as a group. But the other position or issue that I'd like to talk about, and which picks up, I think, on Michelle's point, is that at ALS, we're also really conscious about not wanting to use our position as a scholarly journal with a strong reputation to shore up privilege. And I realise that it does do that to some extent. But Julieanne and I in particular are really concerned to think about the ways in which ALS can be handed over to amplify the voices of other scholars, Indigenous scholars, culturally linguistic scholars as well. We've talked about setting up a fellowship program to do this. We also started to investigate a bilingual issue of ALS, thinking into the future as well. But again, these run into the issues of funding, because we don't want to in any way exploit translators or scholars who might contribute to that. So we're trying to think about ways in which we can increase the diversity of the journal, both what we receive and what we publish, in ways that are useful and also meaningful, and also ensure equity. And when I look across the journal landscape, I certainly would like to acknowledge that other journals who are working in that intersection between, the creative and the scholarly are doing a much better job than ALS possibly at the moment. So Westerly, for example, I think is exemplary in this regard. And it's our task, I think, as editors, Julieanne and I, to really dedicate ourselves to thinking about what a more traditional scholarly journal can do to contribute in that way as well. That's it.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Next up, we have Catriona Menzies-Pike, who's the editor of the Sydney Review of Books. Oh, and I'm so glad that there's a puppy in the frame. Thank you, Evelyn and Jonathan. So, Catriona, are you there? Yes, great.
Hi, everyone. Hello, especially to the puppy. I am calling in from Gadigal land, where I live and work at the moment. And I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners, past, present, and emerging. Thank you for organising this panel, Julieanne. It feels very timely. It does seem to me that literary journals and literary criticism have always kind of existed in one form of crisis or another. And there's a sense that the golden days are always just in the past. It's hard for me to tell whether this moment now will one day be seen as generative. But right now, the future of the Sydney Review of Books and of literary journals generally does feel very precarious. That's firstly and most obviously because of funding. But it's also because of the stultifying effect on debate, of thinking about literary value, of funding scarcity. When Evelyn spoke before about the amount of time that's required to seek out collaborations, as I know you've done, Michelle, to seek out partnerships, new forms of income. It leaves little space to do the work that we see is our work, and it leaves even less space for thinking and talking about the value of our work, the values that we wish our work to embody. I think funding pressures do tend to encourage forms of defensiveness that manifest different kinds of crises: stagnation, conservatism. When precarity is the norm, criticism is not always well received. When there's not enough funding to go around, and right now there just isn't for literary journals, it can be very difficult to yield ground, to own mistakes, and let alone to model what the future of literary criticism of literary journals in this country might be. So to do more than to survive and to be a bit better, I think literary journals, literary criticism as a field, needs to learn how to advocate better for our value and to think about the kinds of journals, the kinds of practice we want to see valued in the future. And there are two elements to this, and I want to speak briefly to each of them, but very separately. One is being able to speak the language of institutions, both individually and collectively. And two is being able to speak to each other as editors, as writers, as readers, as critics, about literary journals in ways that aren't always strategic and instrumental about our value. I've been reflecting on this through the course of this year as I fill in limitless funding applications in which I talk about the value that's represented by the Sydney Review of Books. And I'm very conscious that the form of value that I present to potential funding partners and collaborators is often quite different to my sense of where I think the worth of the work we do lies, and particularly the publication process. To my mind, there is a really urgent need to be able to demonstrate more clearly the value of journals and periodicals, of literary criticism, to the development of the literary sector, its role in the cultural infrastructure, to borrow Julieanne's phrase from earlier on. I think we need to be able to do this to funding agencies primarily, but also to the universities in which we work. I see this as much a collective endeavour as it is an individual endeavour. Most of the journals on this panel are in competition for funding, we know this, and yet we are also all really stand to gain if we can better advocate for that funding pool to be much bigger. And this would allow us to pay writers better. We allow us to pay writers to develop more writers, to develop more different kinds of practice. It allows us to clarify the role that a critical culture plays. It's distressed me to register how low the profile of literature is generally in the arts policy debate. And we've seen that in the last few months as arts policy has had something of a media moment in the COVID shutdown. Journals, of course, barely register here. The extremely demoralising outcomes for literary journals in the recent 4-year funding round from the Australia Council also suggests a pretty low priority. As we've already heard, often funding bodies don't recognise publication in journals or of journals as outputs. It's been very hard for me over the years to position the online publication that the Sydney Review of Books delivers as an acceptable output. They're certainly subordinate to exhibitions or performances. We can easily say we've run a workshop and that's high value. Publishing an essay online, which is really our work, less so. And I'm very conscious that publication in literary journals often doesn't serve academics well in terms of triaging time and outcomes. So I think as a group, there is work to do in articulating how journals fit into the cultural and intellectual economy of this large island, how they help it to grow, finding out ways of expressing how journals and literary criticism meet the jobs and growth agenda of Australian literature. I'm being somewhat facetious here, but this is the cultural measurement approach to value. And I think if literary journals are to have a future, we need to find answers to these questions together and perhaps be able to access a greater pool of funding and share some resources. This would be useful to me personally because to my frustration, thinking about cultural measurement, thinking about the outputs and impacts makes it very hard to think in other frames about journals and even harder to be self-reflective and critical of our sector. I think the demands of seeking funding can obscure the work, the political, the aesthetic, the intellectual value of the work that we do by sapping our energy. How do you make a case for journals allowing risk-taking when the expectation is constant excellence? Not all risks pay off, nor should they. How do we make the case for writing of limited appeal, which I think I certainly want to publish? In the critical sphere, where's the space for negative evaluation? What falls outside these rubrics? We're also often asked in these funding scenes to report on diversity and inclusion, as if that was sufficient to mitigate the ongoing lack of diversity in our sector and the structural inequalities in our sector. We know that limited funding has a much greater impact on marginalised voices, that fewer journals, less funding, risks homogenising the work that we do. When there are fewer journals left standing, there are fewer writers, there are fewer editors working. But I don't think that funding is the only reason for the lack of diversity in our sector. And only talking about the funding and working on the funding makes it much harder to expand this discussion. I think the conversations taking place on social media this week around Verity Law was so instructive and enlivening because they take place so rarely in formal settings. I'd love to see more of the questions raised in those Twitter threads raised in situations like this. Do we want all of our literary gatekeepers to be white? If not, what do we do to expand the field? How can journals shift structural inequality? I think if we're talking about the future of literary journals and literary criticism, I do hope literary journals and literary criticism have a future. I want to keep working on them. These are the questions I think we need to confront. And so I suppose I have a double proposition. Firstly, that if we want to be funded, we need to be able to make a clearer case for our work as a group, as a sector, as a collective, one that is much more legible to funding bodies. And secondly, that we need to step away from that and talk about our work in ways that aren't decreed by the categories on the forms, and to think about our future in much more expansive terms. That's it for me.
Thanks so much, Catriona. And I do hope that this conversation can be the beginning of that kind of conversation that we can take out of this room and continue it afterwards as well. So our next speaker is Kate Noske, who is the editor of Westerly.
Hi everybody, thanks Julieanne for including me here, and I just need to recognise first up that I'm joining you all from Wajak Noongar country, that country was never ceded and its sovereignty is maintained, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and future. I'm firstly in awe of the panel of people we've got here today. This is really, really lovely as a conversation, and I think you're absolutely right, Catriona, that we need to make more space for this conversation as a sector. And I'm going to recover some ground, I'm afraid, but I'm not clever enough to ad-lib, so I've prepared a couple of notes, and I'm going to stick to that to avoid sounding like a bumbling idiot. The greatest challenge for Westerly, as always, is funding, and that's been simmering under everybody's offerings so far, I think, is the core factor here. And I want to talk about funding for Westerly because ultimately we're one of the really lucky ones. We've had 4 years now being fully funded in a budget, which has been a beautiful period of stability and absolutely joyous. But even behind that, we're tenuous. And I think if we as one of the lucky ones fully funded are feeling tenuous, then I can't imagine how difficult this is as a day-to-day struggle for other magazines. So I wanted to break down where we're at with Westerly and firstly recognise that a large part of our funding is institutional. So we're within that institutional context, and speaking the language of institutions is an excellent way to describe that, because as Liz McMahon articulated so beautifully yesterday with regards to Southerly, Westerly sits between points of institutional definitions of value. We publish a combination of creative work and scholarly peer-reviewed articles. So as a research publication, UWA would like to see us offer more research in open access. As a creative publication, though, they benefit from our community engagement and impact. So we're spread across those two poles in some ways. We also have a commitment to a minimum of 5% First Nations authored material in every issue and publication, which is led by our editor for Indigenous writing, Elfi Shiosaki, who's a Noongar academic and editor here at UWA. And with Elfi in that role, the university benefits as well from this as a narrative of equity and cultural outreach, which they play off quite regularly. So we see different points of the institution engaging with what we offer. But at the same time, you know, we're really grateful to receive the university's funding, which is both financial and in support and workload. Part of my workload as lecturer here is in editing. I find myself, though, often having to remind different points of institutional discourse that this isn't charity, that we actually bring things to the table for the institution and that we offer value in return for that institutional engagement. And there are elements of our activity which are really difficult to fit into an institutional frame. So, for example, the payment of authors, we pay as much as we can, but compared to, you know, the system which is being geared to process much larger sums like student course fees, the difficulty of paying a single author a small amount as a one-off payment is really quite ludicrous and takes up huge amounts of time. So the manner in which Westerly's value as a fluctuating commodity to the university sort of depends on which narrative happens to be in ascension at that time, and you know how their system is geared to operate at that particular moment, knowing that university admin systems change in the blink of an eye. You know, makes it quite difficult for us to feel like even with that institutional support we are secure in that relationship. And as such, we're still quite reliant on external funding as well to supplement our regular activities and our regular production. So alongside the question of value internally to the institution, though, there's that question that others have raised here already about the slow decline in the arts funding over the last 5 years, which shows that, or longer probably too, which shows that more broadly the arts are undervalued socially and culturally in Australia. And I'm going to use some statistics here because I found them really powerful in the last couple of months. There's the sense prevails that it's a small industry, and I think one of our senior politicians referred to that quite recently, when in fact it makes $111 billion as a contribution to the economy annually at last assessment. That was in a 2018 report. And it employs 3 times as many people as coal mining, as the Australia Institute pointed us to recently. In that report, the Australia Institute surveyed a large number of people, and 68% of people surveyed assumed that coal mining employs significantly more people than the arts. So we have a real disjunct between the reality and the perception of the arts on a social level. And the result is that this has allowed governmental defunding, making it harder and harder for the extant funding bodies, which remain at arm's length and I think do a really fabulous job under horrible circumstances of cut budgets. But you know, the funding has become more and more competitive as that dollar amount has dropped. And the reality is the result of seeing major and successful magazines defunded, such as ABR most recently. We now apply up to 7 times a year in project applications. I can see a year coming soon where not one of those is successful. We've been lucky enough in the last 12 months that we've received enough. We've received 3 successful applications out of that 7 to keep us going as fully funded for the next 12 months. But even then, we've got, you know, a year's period that we're working on at each point in time, and the burden of 7 applications to try and get that funding across the line. So a challenge for me for Westerly is the burden of work involved in seeking that funding, and as others have pointed out, what that detracts from in other work in terms of the actual activity of literary publication and the slightly stronger, you know, desires that we have to contemplate the values of what we do, how we can articulate and engaging in more productive conversations than why I should justify this budget line or that budget line. The second challenge is promoting subscription to a readership who are loyal in engaging with literary mags, but also often subscribing to multiple magazines at once. There's a relatively small pool of readers, I think, who subscribe to several literary magazines and help create stable subscription, but who are also vulnerable to feeling financial pressure because of that and to dropping one or another of those subscriptions in times where things are a bit tighter. And with COVID, we've seen that. Our subscription income has declined this year by 25.4% to date. That drop will have a long tail as well, because that represents an audience who we have regular contact with over the next 12 months that is 25% smaller than it would be otherwise, and a readership that is 25% smaller than it would be otherwise. So we have less possibility for actively engaging with our subscriber, with a large subscriber base, to create audience cultivation. And I'm quite sure that it will take a while for our subscription rate to recover to a point where it's in growth models again from our point where we were last year. It's much easier to convince a reader to continue a subscription than it is to convince a reader to resume an old one or to take up a new one, for example. And this drop doesn't account for single issue sales either. 50% of our single issue sales come from launch events, which are generally pretty well attended. And a discount at launches means that readers can effectively get a discounted subscription if they buy the issue at the launch each time. And this next launch we have, which I might have noticed I disappeared, our printer was delivering our proof, which I'm very excited to have in front of me for our next issue. The next issue launch will be online, and we're really not sure as to how that will affect sales that we would normally expect to receive at that launch event. So our income from subscription is going to diminish this year quite significantly with COVID, and I expect to see that take a long time to recover. So our challenge then in negotiating all of this is firstly to avoid burnout in mitigating this financial loss. And I think burnout on a sector level as well, remembering, you know, that we're talking about this ideal of engaging as a cohort and as a sector to articulate value on a broader level, which is fantastic, but that we're all stretched thin internally as well. And making space and time for that is going to require, you know, for me coming from WA, for example, to meet with others on the East Coast, time and money, and it's quite a difficult proposition in some ways to do. The Literary Magazine Roundtable, which was held for the last couple of years in Melbourne, has been wonderful, but has ultimately fizzled out a little bit, I think, under that very pressure. Secondly, we need to make sure that with the burden of that time in supporting financial effort, that we craft an engaging and accessible and inclusive space in the magazine that is maintained as a priority. Whether that be in the digital space or in the actual space of the publication and the voices that we collect together there to create vibrancy and richness to carry the journal forward, rather than simply existing in stasis under the pressure of maintaining financial security. So my final provocation, as Jonathan started, and as I hope you know, is preaching to the choir largely, is that we need subscribers, and institutional subscriptions make a huge difference to a magazine as a source of reliable income, because subscriptions can be depended on from institutions when an institutional library is maintaining an ongoing engagement with a magazine. So I ask you to all check whether or not your institution subscribes to Westerly, whether its library lists Westerly in the catalogue, and to either ensure that you subscribe to us in the next round with an agency subscription like EBSCO or something like that, or to contact us directly for one of our fantastic institutional digital subscriptions, which give full access in the same way as a ProQuest database or something along those lines. Those databases for us have proved to actually result in a subscription, a loss of subscription income. We wouldn't see enough coming back from something like ProQuest to support what we would lose in the subscriptions from the number of institutions who have access to it. So, you know, these direct subscriptions from institutions are phenomenally important. It can't be underestimated. So I'll leave that there as a little provocation, with thanks again to Julieanne for this panel.
Thank you, Kate. And I'd add to that just that there is a question around the stability of institutional subscriptions in the light of university funding at post-COVID. So I do think that there is a risk to that previously assumed stable funding base that we at ALS certainly rely on, that's under question at the moment too, I think. Anyway, another point. So finally, I would like to go to Ellen Smith, the editor of JASAL. Ellen, over to you.
Thanks, Julieanne. Thanks, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the traditional owners. So interesting to hear from people working across the kind of range of different kinds of literary journals. I think, you know, we do different work, but I think there's a common problem here that I've heard in what people have been saying about how to have the work we do valued, and how to have the work of literary journals recognised and registered. It seems that, you know, what we think of as important is not necessarily what's considered important in terms of rankings and funding models. And I suppose one thing I've been thinking about as people have been talking is whether there are ways for us together to kind of set the terms on which our work is valued. Is there a way for us to do that, to be a little bit more in control of the terms of valuing and recognising this work? I thought today I would talk a little bit about the history of JASAL, it's the Journal of the Association for the Study of Australian Literature. It's an academic literary journal which is attached to the organisation, ASAL, that's putting on this conference. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about its history as a way of saying something about the value of literary journals, and particularly academic journals like JASAL's, that perhaps aren't captured or registered by the metric systems for measuring impact, counting citations, determining rankings, doling out research allocations, and so on. I want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm going to say today is based on a conversation I had with Susan Lever last week, which was extremely useful because she's kind of been there from the start and knows a lot more about the history of JASAL than I do, I'd have to say, and has also kind of worked tirelessly for ASAL, so I would acknowledge that. And also others who are here who've done work for JASAL, like Tanya, for example. So I think, you know, JASAL is a good kind of case study for thinking about what doesn't register in terms of rankings and metrics and things, because I think, you know, historically and into the present, its role in the Australian literature community hasn't always measured in terms of these kinds of metric systems. This has been a strength of JASAL, but also a challenge, I think, for the editors of the journal to work out how to position JASAL. So the first issue of JASAL came out in 1994, and it published the proceedings of the 16th conference of ASAL at ADFA and UNSW, as edited by Susan Lever and Catherine Pratt. It contains 33 papers that are about 3,000 words each, and they're just conference proceedings. They're not academic articles. They're not peer reviewed. It just attempts to be a kind of complete record of the papers given at the conference. I think it publishes all but one paper published at the conference. Susan could probably correct that. And JASAL keeps doing that for about 7 years. In 1998, the proceedings of the conference are refereed, but it's still a very kind of substantial and substantive record of the conference. And then in 2002, JASAL becomes a peer-reviewed journal. It publishes longer articles, but less of them. But what it starts doing is having a substantial review section, and this is something that JASAL keeps doing. That is, it tries to give a kind of pretty comprehensive reviews of scholarly works in the field of Australian literature. And, you know, these are works that might not get reviewed in other places. Kind of JASAL is the place where you can kind of count on getting your book on Australian literature reviewed. In 2006, JASAL goes online, and it's open access from the beginning, hosted by the NLA. So a couple of things I think we can observe here about this history. I think firstly, in those early publications of conference proceedings, you get a really rich sense of the conversation that's happening at that moment. They're very interesting historical documents for that reason. They're a kind of a record of a conference as a collaborative scholarly endeavour of a historical moment. There's less editorial oversight of these publications. You know, they're not peer reviewed, but I think there's something else that they're able to capture for that reason, something about a kind of community and practice, something about a conversation, something about like what people are saying about Australian literature at that moment in, you know, 1997. The switch to peer-reviewed conference proceedings and then to a peer-reviewed academic journal, I think, reflects the pressure on academics to publish in this way. Probably something is lost when that happens. But JASAL, I think, does a pretty good job of maintaining its commitment to being a record of an organisation and a scholarly community. It does this by continuing to publish conference proceedings, although perhaps not quite as exhaustively, and through publishing comprehensive reviews, as I've spoken about. I think this is also reflected in JASAL's commitment to being open access, which reflects a desire to speak not just to academics, but also to a broader audience. So there's, there's no paywall like there is for a lot of academic journals, and particularly those that have been taken over by the big international publishing houses like Taylor and Francis and so on. So basically what that means is, say, you're a high school teacher or you're a high school student or you're in a book club, you're just interested in Australian literature, you can have access to the work in JASAL. This, I think, reflects really well in the kind of user views we get. JASAL reaches out to a pretty large audience. I did some kind of work into looking at our downloads, and they're pretty good. Actually, a lot of the articles JASAL publishes have, in excess of 1,000 or 2,000 downloads. And compared to the number of downloads you get, even at some of the kind of top tier Taylor and Francis journals, they're actually better. We're actually getting more engagement and more downloads than this, than those places. However, this doesn't translate into the terms of kind of metrics and rankings very well. JASAL doesn't appear on Scopus or Scamargo. It's not a Q1 whatever journal. And I think this is something that JASAL has kind of continually struggled with. There are things that JASAL wants to do, which just, in terms of being open access, in terms of kind of providing a record of this organisation, which just don't translate into the world of rankings. I think that's perhaps all I'm going to say for the moment, because I'm aware of time. So perhaps that's it. Perhaps I'll finish just by saying what I started with, which was, the common question that seems to be coming up among everybody who's talking here is one about value, and how we kind of try to do something to kind of set the terms on which our work is valued, in order to register the things that we think is important about our work that perhaps isn't captured by institutions and the kind of funding bodies and the ranking systems. That's it. Thanks, Julieanne.
Thanks so much, Ellen. I've been given the go-ahead from our conference organiser to go a little over time, which I'm very pleased about, because it means we can have a little bit of a conversation. So I would like to open this up to questions from the floor, or indeed for any of the panellists here to respond to one another's discussions. So if anyone on the panel would like to unmute yourselves, or anyone who's not on the panel would like to wave at me or put a question in the chat box.
Could I just say something?
Sure.
I think it's probably worth remembering that we, at least within institutions, we are advocating along the lines that you're suggesting, Ellen. Like I spend a lot of time in meetings talking about the value of what we do, and I feel like I've done this now for decades and continue to do it, and will continue to do it. So I think that there's not that sense that we're laying down and just accepting the metrics, but I think it is about claiming a space. Again, this is within an institution I'm speaking. I realise that these journals also have audiences beyond the institution, but in terms of thinking about how academic work is verified, then there's certainly strong voices and conversations happening around that. It's not a reassurance, but I guess it's more just a signalling of advocacy within university to value, or to kind of create a narrative around the value of what we do.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely.
Yes, Kate.
I'll just add to that too. I think it's not just creating that narrative of value within a single institution as well, but working out ways we can feed that back into a broader institutional context and open that up to a general sort of social and cultural conversation as well. And I think that comes back to that bigger question of how the arts and humanities within an institution articulate what we do on a social level, and how that connects to, you know, broader outcomes, the sense that a humanities degree has no jobs pathway or no direct career trajectory being the case in point right now.
We have a question from Anne Elvey, which I think is probably coming out of the Verity Law dispute that's happened over the last week or so. And this question is about whether there are industry-wide protocols for dealing with disputes when they arise, or whether it's up to individual publications, their editors and boards. My feeling is that this is all linked to the question of funding and how these different journals are institutionally situated. So our ability to govern well as organisations, as non-profit organisations, as many of us are, really relates to that situation. I think it varies wildly across the board. But does anyone else have any responses to that question of how you, as journal editors, as people who are managing non-profit organisations, often deal with disputes as they arise, the kinds of disputes that have come up in relation to Verity Law this week?
We can jump in on that, I suppose. Although we are sort of, I suppose, less experienced in the Zoom at the moment. We have been in a process of developing our policy and procedures documentation. We inherited a lot of, constitutional guidelines from the 1950s, which are, of course, couched in some very unhelpful language and implications. And a lot of the changes that have taken place in Overland over the last few decades have been pushed by sort of the solidarity of editors and workers, deputy editors and such. But we are in the process now of formalising a lot of our policies and procedures and guidelines. Some of those are always dictated by your funding responsibilities. So, for example, our probably primary funding body at the moment is Creative Victoria, which has recently been really emphasising organisational accountability and training and such, which is very good, because the sort of the somewhat sort of nebulous nature of these industries, where you have some people who are formally employed by academic institutions, you have freelancers, you have casuals. It is very difficult to sort of link that back to any structure of responsibility beyond just a general kind of principles and morality that govern the humanities, and we can, and the recent events have obviously demonstrated that, that's not evenly felt or experienced, and forms of harm can be differently interpreted there, and people can be wrong. Yep. And so a lot of what we've been doing has been based on the guidelines from the Media Arts Entertainment Alliance, the Media Entertainment and Arts Alliance, and having a really strong relationship with them and with unions, I think, is really crucial. It's definitely been a strong sort of resource for us to be able to receive that guidance and leadership, and also training, accountability and such, like being able to actually speak to organisers who have experience with with educating us on these issues has been very important. So I do think that a stronger participation from the NTEU would be lovely in this instance as well, and having sort of these research networks, better communication channels throughout research, educational and publishing networks would be very helpful, I think, for those of us who are in the situation that we're in, where we are trying to formulate those guidelines and look at how they can be applied. Yeah.
What's interesting about the Verity Law situation, Anne, is that they actually did have some of the processes that I think a lot of us have, which is that you consult someone of a particular community if a piece of writing touches upon them. And the interesting thing about Very Low is that's a failure of exactly that process, because that did happen from what I understand of the situation. Then putting the editors in a situation where they had a problem between two different kinds of value, their own perception of the literary value of the piece, and their consultants' views of it as offensive and or racist. And what's interesting about that is it's a failure of the systems that I think we do actually all have as journals, that we consult so-and-so, that we have an Indigenous editor, that we have so on and so forth. Which sort of segues, I think, into something that's interesting consistently across what everybody seems to be saying, is that we do seem to be not speaking well about our own value, both to funding bodies and perhaps to the public and to ourselves and to governments. And whether or not that's symptomatic of a broader problem in the humanities, I don't know, but that does seem to be the situation.
And actually, just one more thing to kind of like emphasize on that. I think part of that problem about that problem of, you know, attesting to our own value does come down to the fact that the majority of the editorial positions are filled by, you know, people who we would not really classify as being culturally, linguistically diverse, you know, people of colour and culture and such. Largely because I think we do still have quite a significant problem in Australia of the sort of the creative emphasis being placed as a burden on people of colour and culture, and there being few opportunities in terms of access for people of colour and culture to, you know, take the expensive masters that'll teach you publishing and editorial skills to get those networks. So there's very often just an overemphasis of that that creative output, as opposed to those positions in which, you know, people of colour and culture could be advocating for better representation and better curatorial responsibility. And you know, I certainly found that when I was sort of more creatively focused earlier in my career. So, yes.
No, I agree. It's vitally important. Would anyone else like to respond to that question before we move on to another? Okay, so we have a question from Prema, and that is talking about the strong online presence of many Auslit journals. Are there efforts in the general literary journal community to move towards less periodical, more digital/ephemeral media? And it might be interesting to think about some of what might be lost or gained in that process as well. Would anyone like to address that? Kate, I know Westerly has a very active online presence.
Yeah, I can jump in there. I mean, I don't know that our online presence is any more active than Overland's, for instance. I think that you guys do an incredible job there. But for me, I think this idea of digital media supporting the space of the journal is, for Westerly, given that our production's only twice a year, part of our effort to create that space and community around the journal as a concept rather than around the journal as a publication, and that the two feed into each other and support each other mutually. So yeah, I think there is definitely something to be gained in that digital space with different mechanisms for conversation, different points of access, different points of inclusion, particularly with open access offering free and thus slightly more equitable points of engagement. But at the same time, I have no desire to move away from periodical print publication, because I think that offers something really important as well. And as long as I'm editor, Westerly certainly won't be going fully digital. We'll certainly stay with the print publication too. So I think it's more a challenge to my mind of how those spaces can complement each other and what they can contribute to the magazine overall, rather than thinking about it as you know, a win-loss situation on either side.
I wonder, Catriona, if I could ask you to speak as well as as the editor of a Born Digital journal.
Yes, I'd love to. So we only publish online and we're Born Digital, as Julieanne says. And I guess our aspiration is wholly digital and not ephemeral. And over the years, I've really become accustomed to thinking about our publication practices in terms of what we publish each week or what we publish each month, but thinking about the audience and reception for them in much less bounded terms. This gives me like a great deal more flexibility than anybody working to a print deadline has, because I can really make a decision on Monday or Tuesday morning as to what the week will look like, and if someone suddenly decides that they need to rewrite something or whatever else happens. But our aspiration is that that we're not read like a periodical. People come to there are people who read the SRB each week or visit regularly and kind of catch up on new things on the journal. But more and more we find people come to us through keywords, through their own social media channels, or through other reference networks. So the unit of the periodical isn't an important structuring device. We now publish probably about a quarter of our program is devoted to what we call very expansively literary essays. And those are generally themed or published in series. And we seek funding for them as individual projects. And those series now kind of run over several years. And we think of that as, if you liked Evelyn's amazing Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie and the Ghost Gum essay, you can connect to a whole series of other essays in that kind of theme. So it's very enabling for us.
We have, thank you, Catriona. We have another question from Sue Lever about saying that SRB and JASAL are open access. Are the other journals part of the campaign to stop the cycle of universities supporting the production of journals, then allowing Taylor and Francis to make money from selling them back to institutions? I have some strong thoughts about this. And that is one of the reasons that ALS has remained independent. It's much harder to be a scholarly journal and not be published by Taylor and Francis. Like, our lives would be much easier if we were, and I strongly disagree with their financial model and their publishing model. And so what we've tried to do is a blend where new essays are open access first, and then they go behind a paywall, which enables us to pay our copy editors, our associate editor, who's an ECR, and so on. So that's kind of how we negotiate that situation. We think it's really important that we're able to pay our staff in literary journals, that we don't rely on unpaid labour. I think that is where governance issues go awry, when we are unequally relying on unpaid labour. So it's a difficult balance between enabling access to the material, but also enabling equity in our work, the workplaces that we are managing. And also, I think, in just enabling cheap subscriptions. So in ALS, if you're an individual, a subscription is $24 for the year, so you can manage, that does enable people to access it in a way that you can't, for example, a Taylor and Francis journal. Sorry, so that's my 2 cents about that. As chair, I should shut up. I know, and let the rest of you respond to that question about open access and that whole situation with university subscriptions.
Can I jump in on this one? Because the SRB is free, and the SRB is also desperately seeking income from, whatever quarter. And when we have conversations with our board or among our staff about how we're going to fund the journal, this question of subscriptions comes up again and again. And from my perspective, a paywall is really undesirable for a couple of reasons. One, is that it would see our audience plummet, that people who are in Montana wanting to find out about Alexis Wright will not get to the Sydney Review of Books if we're behind a paywall. But also it seems to me that the margins are so low that to paywall or to implement a subscriber system would not really yield the kind of income that we require to pay writers, to pay editorial staff. I should be plugging, we are going to be launching a donations capacity on the site soon, but that will be more like a public radio model, where if you want to support the SRB, you can do so. And if you're not able to do so, or you firmly don't want to do so, you can still read everything on the site.
This as well.
Yes.
I think the problem isn't just Taylor and Francis, and I know that's just one example, but databases like ProQuest and Format, Project Muse, they all make a large amount of money off institutions, and the journals get relatively small amounts back, though with some exceptions getting quite good returns. I think it comes back to that question of institutional logic as well, and the difficulty of demonstrating to an institution that the easy solution isn't necessarily the most cost effective. We have a lot of trouble communicating to institutions that yes, it takes an admin person in the library an extra 10 minutes to not add Westerly's name to a database list, but instead to engage with us directly and create a subscription with us directly. But that ultimately that will be at a much cheaper cost level for the university to continue its subscription to Westerly in the long run. So there's a problem of logic in the manner in which institutions manage subscriptions. And I'm really struggling to overcome that. I don't have any solutions, but I think there is a flip side to what the journal's offering as opposed to how the university wants to engage and what they see as the easiest solution for engagement.
I agree, and I think also an issue is declining university library budgets. Their budgets are absolutely squeezed, and so these librarians don't have the time. The people who would do that indexing work don't have the time they would once have had. We struggle with this a lot at ALS as well. Also, once your work is in ProQuest or EBSCO, it's very hard to get it out again. Yeah, so it's an issue that we have found. Would anyone else like to speak to that question?
Can I just say something about we were approached by EBSCO but decided not to go down that track. Our articles have always been available free, and I just want to say that I think it's shows a lot of vision on the part of the Australia Council and Copyright Agency Limited to have supported online journals like Mascara, Corr Diet and so forth, and the Sydney Review of Books as well. I would like to point out as well that we were one of the first online journals, and we received very little funding for the reasons that I outlined earlier in terms of structural discrimination and so forth, like etc. And we then noticed that other journals saw the advantage of this and went online and received enormous amounts of funding. So I think it's really been a positive move that kind of just very natural tendency has been contested, and that the space is now more contested for culturally and linguistically diverse editors to be able to get access for producing literary work of high quality, both creative and critical, that is accessible and can expand our audience and our readership, and it can expand our scholarship about the texts that we engage with, and without. When we don't have like the infrastructure, we don't have the institutional support, we don't have very long-standing relationships with universities and organisations. Therefore, the online space is a critical space for us. It's also a space where social media is powerful. I think the issue with Verity La is a problematic one, and I think that the issues that were underlying that particular piece of writing are very real issues, and I think that the social media space is a very powerful space and a very real material space where which kind of bypasses some of the institutional privilege that we've been talking about today, that many of us are dealing, are aware of and trying to kind of negotiate and mediate pathways so that we can be more inclusive as literary journals. I think really essentially we're all facing very similar sorts of issues about having to work very hard just to get the funding dollars in and applications and then having a lot of having to have a lot of correspondence to deal with, and then having not as much time to actually do the editing and to consider the issues around literary value.
Yeah, I agree. We have another question from Christopher Spicer, which I guess is a question asking to look under the hood of our journals a little, and asking if subscriptions to journals have declined, what about contributions and submissions? Have these been continuing? And can editors comment about the quality of submissions? Okay, brave editors, who's going to comment on their submission rates and quality? Jonathan, go for it.
We've got heaps of submissions of all kinds, far more than we could possibly publish to be honest?
Yeah, we across different categories, and of course, you know, Overland publishes essay,
poetry,
fiction review. We are adapting our model of reviewing. I think you know, journals like Sydney Review of Books definitely demonstrate that the standard in Australian reviewing is, like, you know, we are all capable of pushing that, you know, to much more interesting and critical spaces, and so we're kind of like, you know, a bit in awe of all of the work that you're doing in that regard, Catriona. So we're looking at our own reformulation there. We are finding that we're receiving increasingly more submissions internationally. There seem to be sort of habits of perhaps newsletters or university courses where they just say, here's a bunch of places where you can send work, which means that we're getting like dozens of essays from, you know, students who are just submitting all of their coursework.
Yeah, so read quality, Christopher, a lot of them are terrible.
They're not ready for publication. So we receive a great diversity there, and one of the difficulties that we do have is being able to give appropriate feedback as much as we would like. Unfortunately, we do end up having to fall into sort of, you know, patterns of you know, the blanket responses of thanks but no thanks, this isn't for us. And we would love to be able to invest more time in editing and
but again, that's
such.
a funding thing, and
Yes.
paid versus unpaid labor as well.
In terms of subscriptions, we have actually managed to increase our subscriptions since taking over at Overland by a pretty considerable amount, which has been fantastic. But a lot of that has been dependent on things like, you know, we've implemented, say, Subscribe-a-thon, which is an insane feat of organisation where we were partnering with, you know, about 30 different sponsors and donors to incentivize people to subscribe. And a lot of our subscriptions also come through prizes, which can again be very difficult to coordinate, because that's either going to be sponsored by a foundation or you know, some kind of organisation, institution. You know, it's been a pretty big impact on us that we weren't able to run the Victoria University Short Story Prize, and we do know that is very difficult for a lot of our writers who will really only put the effort in entering in submissions around prizes, because they just know that, you know, it's so competitive. You get paid so little for writing, really, for what it's worth, you know, and for how much time goes into research. So the lack of those competitions, I think, has been an issue for us that we are attempting to work on ourselves. But generally, we think, like, you know, the subscription model, the submission model that we've got is just ever increasingly bringing in people and encouraging them to write and comment, whereas, you know, 10 years ago they never would have dreamed of it. So we love that aspect of it. It creates a lot of work, though, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I want to say congratulations on that, because that is a real achievement, a real material achievement in such a short time. So well done. Could any other journal editors brave enough to talk about their submission rates and quality? Okay, go for it.
I've got the latest stats from our last issue, if that helps. So for our last issue, we had over 700 submissions. The majority of those, over 60%, were in poetry, where there's up to 5 poems submitted in each submission. So that's a phenomenal amount of work in total. Like you guys, I find that the quality is mixed. There tends to be a large amount of material that is not submission ready, and a large amount of material that is really highly competitive and excellent, and not a whole lot in between. It's spread quite dramatically across those two poles. So we publish between 50 and 65 pieces in each issue, depending again on how much budget we have, how much page space, all of that sort of thing, which equates to somewhere between 5 and 10% publication of the submission pool in each issue. So you can see it is a phenomenally small amount of the submitted work that's published. Yeah, seconding Julieanne's congratulations to you guys for that work at Overland to support your readership. That's phenomenal and huge, and that sort of effort of readership actually makes a fairly drastic contribution to how much we can publish as well. We have a policy that we ask writers to subscribe if we publish their work. It's not mandated, but it's part of our payment information that we suggest, you know, we will give you a much discounted subscription if you will take that out of your payment. We understand that not every writer can afford to do that, given, as you say, Evelyn, the huge amount of labour that goes into each piece and the respondingly mediocre pay that comes back. But through that, we hope to create a community around the journal of people who we know have directly engaged with us, that will continue engaging with us and can support and extend that subscription base to help support and extend greater page space and open up further publication opportunities in turn. So we try and think of it as a bit of a cyclical project, that relationship between subscription and contributions published.
And it does occur to me that we do all need to perhaps take from a question that Susan asked way back, and I've lost track of the chat. There's too much chat. It's wonderful. But that question about our readers and what our readers have to say about why they value, what they value in our work, and perhaps that's a way of expanding this conversation as well. I am aware that Roger in particular has been on this Zoom stream for many, many hours every day for the last few days, and we probably should let him actually finish the conference. But there's clearly so much more to say, and it's so, I mean, to me, I just find it incredibly inspiring and heartening to be in the company of those editors who are here today. So thank you for taking up your time. I know you're all exhausted and incredibly pressed for time, and I really appreciate you making the time to be here today. And I also think this is a really heartening, even though we're facing all of these challenges, really heartening to see all of this energy and smarts that is invested in the field really broadly at the moment. So I think we're a perfect way to finish this ASAL conference as well, I think, for that reason. So could you all please join me in thanking our panelists today in whatever way you like. You can unmute yourselves and applause or use the thing. Thank you so much all, and I really do hope that we can continue this conversation in other forms.